Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of the Daily Run, and today we're playing as Maggie. Maggie is a character that has a reputation of being one of the slowest characters in the game, but to kind of alleviate for the fact that it's much harder to dodge with her, she actually has a lot more starting HP. And she actually starts with more HP than any other character, so 4 health, which doesn't make too big of a difference if you're experienced in the game. Having 3 or 4 health isn't that big of a deal, but for a new player, having that 4 health and an ability to actually regenerate it via your active item, it makes her the perfect character for someone who's new to the game. But thankfully, even though Maggie is kinda known as being the bad character, we can use the fact that she has a lot of HP to her advantage, at least in this situation, because the first item we got was the Piggy Bank, and the Piggy Bank is an item that whenever you get hit, you actually drop a few coins on the ground. So what happens is we can go to the curse room and actually intentionally hit ourselves, because we have a lot of HP, and kind of produce a lot of money, and thankfully that was enough for us to actually be able to afford the Champion's Belt, which is a shop item which increases your damage and the frequency of champion enemy spawns. So I don't have to say why damage up is good. Obviously we can clear the rooms faster, we can kill enemies faster, there's less danger to us actually getting hit. It's all good, but the champion frequency is something that I never explained before, but having a higher chance of champion enemies to spawn is actually a good thing for us, at least on daily runs. Sure, they are stronger and then they actually hit harder whenever you encounter them, but if you're able to afford them, maybe if you're strong enough to kill them, they actually turn out to give you more points than regular enemies. So for that reason, it's actually beneficial for us to encounter more champion enemies. But of course, they also have goodies like giving us coins and keys and consumables, cards, health, whatever, but besides that, they do give you more points. It's not a lot of points, it's maybe in a span of a run, it's maybe like 300, 400 points in total, but when you're kind of competing for the high ranks, those 300 or 400 points really do make a difference. So I'm happy that we were actually able to leverage the advantage Maggie has, so a lot of HP, early on in order to kind of produce that money. It also allowed us to buy a Spirit Heart, which is an item which just allowed us to actually get hit without having to worry about our Devil Deal chance on the second floor, because we did have that Soul Heart buffer. So thankfully everything kind of turned out well up until this point, and if you find a Blood Bank or an IV Bank, it's obviously great as Maggie, because we have 2 chances. From the Blood Bank we can get the health up and the speed up, which is very welcome just because we are super slow. Or the IV bag, which would allow us to actually generate just super a lot of money, not only from IV bag because we have a lot of red health, but also because we have the Piggy Bank, which I mentioned before, and we can kind of double stack the coins we get from that. So kind of everything's going in the right direction here, and the second floor had a pretty nice treasure room. It had the Halo of Flies item, which is an item that gives you 2 orbitals, 2 flies that fly around you, and block bullets. They actually do deal some very small amount of damage, contact damage, but it's nothing too big or to write home about, just because you have to be really close to the enemy to actually hit it. And if you go that close, there's a good chance you're already getting hit yourself. But the thing there is, while it's good to have some defensive options, especially as a slow character, because I always mention this, whenever you're playing as Maggie or as any slow character, it's not as much about reactive dodging, but you have to know which enemies or which attacks the enemies have, so you can kind of position yourself well, so you don't really have to perform crazy maneuvers to dodge their attacks. So having a way to kind of block the shots that you're unable to dodge just because you're too slow is a good thing. So having orbitals, having the soul items, having any basically familiar that blocks bullets for you is a great thing whenever you're playing as Maggie or just, like I said, any other slow character. And while that goes against my principles of course I mentioned this now, but I skipped the Halo of Flies item, which would give us 2 orbitals. My logic there was, sure, that is a good defensive item because we can actually do a lot with it, but at the same time, having 2 more orbitals will not really kind of save a run, if that makes sense. So imagine if we don't get any good items from that point forward. Would having 2 more orbitals really save us from taking damage? Sure, I would say sometimes it would save us, but if you're not strong enough to kind of deal with enemies on your own, just having 2 more orbitals isn't going to do anything for you. So for that reason, I actually decided to reroll it, and thankfully I rerolled it into the Holy Light, which is a great item. The Holy Light shots gives you a chance to shoot the Holy Light shots, and the Holy Light shots, they're colored kind of white, they glow, and when they hit the enemy, they inflict an AoE beam, which means that it hits more enemies, that deals the 4 times amount of damage you have. So if you can kind of land that, it's actually a very good proc to killing both the enemies, because it does hit more enemies at once, and it's both great against bosses because, like I said, it does deal immense amount of damage. So if you can get some lockups in order to increase the frequency of these light shots, it would be actually very good. So our DPS doesn't increase only with our damage getting higher at this point and with our tier ups, so our tier speed getting higher, but it also increases with us getting luck. And the fact we have the PhD also means that we can kind of afford to take a lot of pills in order to further increase our luck. So because the PhD, what happens if we have any luck down pills, it turns them into luck up pills. So that means that we have both the chance of having kind of double the amount of luck up pills that we would normally have. Thankfully, the defensive options I was talking about here don't only come in the form of PhD, but it also came in the form of the Sacrificial Dagger, which is an orbital that I wouldn't pass up. A Sacrificial Dagger is an orbital much similar to the Cube of Meat or the Ball of Bandages in this situation, or just any other orbital basically. It blocks the damage when enemies are trying to hit you with your tears, and it's much nicer that we have at least 2 orbitals instead of just 1, because it does kind of double our chances of not getting hit, or avoiding damage, I guess would be a better term for that. But the Sacrificial Dagger has a great benefit that no other orbital has, and that it deals the most amount of contact damage. And it's also, its hitbox is kind of lenient as well, so it's not as tiny as, like I said, the fly hitbox is. So that means that we can actually use it quite aggressively against a lot of enemies which maybe don't move too erratically or too much, and expect to actually deal just a ton of damage that way. And the thing I like the Sacrificial Dagger and the Cube of Meat or the Ball of Bandages the most on any run is basically that you can kill Mom very fast with it, because whenever Mom stomps her foot down, she's actually quite vulnerable, because the foot, when it's down, it doesn't deal any contact damage, so you can really leverage the orbitals you have to kind of deal just a ton of damage to her. So with that said, we did use the orbitals to our greatest effect, but in order to really kind of stay on top of things and not sacrifice ourselves too much, we need a secondary damage source, so via our tears. And because we do have the Holy Light Shots, I actually decided to pick up the Soy Milk. And Soy Milk is an item which is considered by many to be one of the worst items in the game. And you can truly blame them, because a Soy Milk, what it does, it reduces your damage immensely, but it increases your tear rate. So that means you shoot a lot faster, but your damage is just spoopy. So that means you kind of have to land 10 or 20 shots to kill an enemy, which might not seem which seems like a lot, and it is, just because it's hard to hit enemies because you knock them around with your tears, because they're still affected by knockback. You shoot super fast, so it's kind of hard to aim every single tear you have. So overall, or on average, it takes a lot longer to actually kill an enemy whenever you pick up Soy Milk than if you didn't. But so why did I decide to do it? Well, we do have a tier modifier via the Holy Light Shots. And the Holy Light Shots, what they do is, like I said, they give you a chance to have that holy beams. But with Soy Milk, what happens is, because we shoot so much more frequently, there's actually a lot more Holy Light Shots in the mix as well. And the Holy Light Shots, like I said, the 4 amounts the time of damage that our regular tears do. So in this situation, what happens is they actually deal the same amount of damage that our regular tears would before we picked up Soy Milk. So they kind of deal the same amount of damage we dealt before, but at the same time there's more of them, like I said, just because we are shooting much faster. But more importantly, they deal AoE damage, so we can kind of stack that on top of the damage we have already. So I always mention this, but AoE damage, penetrative shots damage, is basically like a damage multiplier based on the amount of enemies you hit. So if our Holy Light Shots can kill 4 enemies, we're kind of dealing the 4 times the amount of damage we would do with our regular tears, just because, like I said, we are hitting 4 enemies. Or if we're actually able to connect our shots with multiple enemies, that gets increased based on the amount of enemies we hit. So, but it's also very useful against static enemies, so like Hush, for example, because the damage is really, or Soy Milk is really only problematic if the enemies you shoot move around a lot, or if you knock them back around a lot, because that makes it much harder to hit your shots. But when you're shooting an enemy that can't really move around, so like Hush, you can actually connect a lot of that DPS on him without the fear of him moving away. And the fact we have a lot of Holy Light Shots, and because he does spawn a lot of enemies, we kind of take that to our advantage as well. But the great thing here, or the greatest thing I would say, I didn't mention that we had the PhD, which increases the chance of us finding a luck up pill, because the bad pills turn into good pills and we can actually see what the pills are before we take them. And because that chance is increased, we can actually kind of reliably, or not reliably, but it's more likely that we will have a way to increase our damage. Because at this point, because we have Soy Milk, getting tears up is really insignificant. So basically any tears up we get, it's going to be like nothing happened, just because our tear rate is at maximum right now. And if you get any damage up, that's also going to be not as significant, because getting a damage up is not that impactful either, because our damage is reduced basically. So the only way to really increase our DPS now is just to get a lot of luck ups. And thankfully, because we did have the best chance basically to get luck ups, I opted to take the Soy Milk. So while it might be a bit of an unconventional pick, I think it turned out really well in this situation. And that's what I really like about Isaac. It's not just about, it's not black and white, so you don't just have bad items, you don't have good items, but you have items that, well, in majority of cases are super bad. They can still turn out to be actually quite good in a lot of situations. So Soy Milk, while normally bad, it doesn't only synergize with Libra, it also synergizes with items like Lump of Coal. On this situation, you notice that it actually works pretty well with Holy Light Shots as well. It doesn't make us super powerful or overpowered, so it's not a breaking ground by any means. We still kind of have to work in order if you want to hit our enemies, but at the same time it does kind of make it much more enjoyable to play, in my opinion, because whenever you have a run where you can shoot really fast, I think that's much more fun as to playing a run where you don't shoot as fast and maybe deal more damage in return. But that just because I think it's more of an active playstyle. It does make certain enemies more difficult to kill, like I said, because you do have that high tier rate, but at the same time it does really make for a more engaging experience, at least in my opinion. So because this run does go to Mega Satan, but we don't really have to worry about much, because we have so many shots, and we have the Holy Light Shots, we can really deal a lot of damage to him, and not just to him, to his hands as well. And it's important to kind of get the hands out of the way as well, because if you don't get them out of the way and when they start spawning enemies, the hands actually can still deal passive damage to you, or spawn enemies, or just do the attacks he normally does. So for that reason, Mega Satan is one of those characters, I think, that the weaker you are, the harder he is. And of course that makes sense for a lot of bosses, but I think it's really exemplified with this boss, because when you are weak, he does start spawning so many enemies that he becomes progressively harder. So while I think it should be the other way around, the stronger you are, the stronger he should be, or the more enemies he should spawn, it kind of works in reverse, and there's really nothing to complain about there, but it just may be an observation I've made while playing this game. Thankfully, the waves he does spawn don't really affect us with any way, so we're not really worried about any particular enemy. So sometimes when you have a certain combination, you might be worried about a certain type of enemy, so maybe if you don't have penetrative shots, you would be really worried about the splitting guys, or maybe whenever there's multiple characters on the screen. But because, like I said, we are kind of covered on all our bases, we shoot fast, we have a lot of AoE effects, we're not really too worried about dealing enough damage to a single target enemy, or dealing enough damage to multiple enemies at the same time. The great thing about Holy Light is that it can also proc multiple times. So unlike something like Poison, or maybe any other status effect, whenever you charm or poison an enemy, you can't charm or poison them again for like 10 seconds. But with Holy Light, it's basically any shot you shoot is going to be a Holy Light shot, so you're not limited time-wise as to how many poison ticks you can actually apply to an enemy. And I think that's a mistake, or I think that should not happen. I think that if you're brave enough to pick up Soy Milk, the Soy Milk, what it should do, it should remove that cap, that invisibility frames that the enemies get from being able to charmed or poisoned again, or basically any status inflicted as well. Because I think, well, that's a very reasonable kind of limitation to put in the game, that you can't poison enemies, just keep poisoning them. The fact that when you have Soy Milk and you can still poison them only, like I said, once every 10 seconds, it really defeats the purpose. So why would I have Soy Milk if I can just use my regular tears and still proc that poison once in 10 seconds? Sure, if you have Soy Milk, you could proc it like 5 times every 10 seconds, but it doesn't really help you, right? Because there's nothing to be gained there. So I think that limitation should be removed, at least when you have Soy Milk, and I think that would make Soy Milk a much more interesting item. So remove basically the invincibility where you can't afflict status effects on enemies when you have Soy Milk, and I think that would make it a thematically much more interesting item. So that's just my 2 cents, and of course with mods we might expect to see something like that come up. With that said, we did finish 74th, and because, like, again, I did play this daily much later than usual, this is actually a very good score. So I'm really proud that this turned out so well. So in the fact that we picked up one of the worst items in the game, and that it managed to turn out so well is kind of nice, I would have to say. So 43,000 is not a high score for a Mega Satan daily at all, but because this was a rather weak daily, it did net us a lot of, or it did rank us quite higher than usual. So of course when you weed out the cheaters, this is actually like top 50. So of course with every respect, this is a pretty good score. With that said guys, I thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.